Hey folks, welcome back. The goal of this video is to go over our final 3 of Nielsen's 10 heuristics. Let's start with recognition versus recall. So Nielsen defines this heuristic as follows. We want to make sure that we minimize the user's memory load by making objects, actions, and options visible. The user should not have to remember information from one part of the dialogue to another. Instructions for use of the system should be visible or easily retrievable whenever appropriate. So to understand this heuristic, let's take a step significantly back and think about actually short-term memory. So you'll recall from course 1, effectively what you need to remember is that short-term memory is limited, right? We only remember 5 to 9, for instance, digits or 5 to 9 different chunks of things, right? And what Nielsen means by recognition versus recall here is that recall is something where you have to put something in one of those, you have to use one of those 5 to 9 slots, right? Whereas recognition says, I recognize that, right? You don't need to keep that in your short-term memory. And very classically, this is a very important story from user interface design more generally. Command line interfaces where you have to remember what to type in. So this is an example of a command line interface from Mac OS exposing its underlying Unix command line interface. I have to remember that to copy a file, I have to use a certain command. To see what's in a directory, I have to use a certain command, cd, right? This all has to be in my, I always have to recall this. On the other hand, in a graphical user interface, right, I can just go to menus, edit, copy, right? I can recognize the commands I want. It doesn't tax my memory. GUIs succeeded over command line interfaces. Graphical user interfaces defeated command line interfaces effectively because they tax your recall less, they allow you to recognize, or at least that's a major reason why they're so effective relative to CLIs. Now, of course, this is an old battle, right? Graphical user interfaces, this dates back to at least the 80s, right? So Mac had one of the first commercially successful ones. Was much more compelling and easy to use than DOS at that time on the PC side. So we fought this battle a lot in the 1980s, but this is actually a battle that we need to continuously fight in our own user interfaces. And let me show you some great examples of how recognition versus recall, or this heuristic, has actually been very much honored in some very important interfaces that most of us use on a daily or a weekly basis. So let's go to Amazon, right? Obviously a very prominent website. Tons of research has shown that when you're browsing the web, you very often are looking at something that you've looked at before. We call this revisitation, right? So let's say I was shopping for something a couple of days ago, and I thought I found something I wanted to buy, but maybe I wanted to check with my wife if she was okay with me buying it. And now I'm back on my computer and I have to remember, I want to go and actually buy the thing. I have to recall what the specific name of that is unless Amazon does something specific, right? So in the recall version, I have to type in the search bar exactly the product name, right? And if I make a mistake, it's going to cost time and potentially money, right? You're going to see some people drop out of the purchasing process. But Amazon has fixed this through a number of different means, but one of which is it has a browsing history. You can see which items you've looked at. I can recognize that I wanted to buy this personal information management book, or this building online communities book, or this Bruce Springsteen album, right? Oh yes, that's the one. It does not tax my short-term memory. I don't have to recall. This is the way to go. This would be a violation of this heuristic, okay? There are all sorts of other positive examples of people following this heuristic. So for example, or systems following this heuristic. So the very simple convention that's actually implemented in all browsers that I've ever used is that you have a different color, right, for links that you visited than links that you haven't visited. And this is allowing me to recognize places that I've already been, right? Revisitation is very common on the web. I say, oh yes, this is the website that I wanted to go to, or this is the news story of the several news stories here that I remember that I want to visit. The different color allows me to assess this, okay? Another good example is the smart bar in Firefox, right? So when I start typing in Nielsen right now, because I've been putting together this particular lecture, Firefox shows me some websites that I've been to that are associated with this term, right? It's not just a blanket search result, it's places that I've already been. This is allowing me to recognize the website that I wanted to go to, doesn't require me to recall information from my memory about the specific website. Okay? Another good example, Google Sheets, Google Docs, and all of Google Apps pretty much do this. It shows you which things you've used recently. I can just recognize this. This is our course outline, actually, for this course. Has all, whether a video has been recorded, whether it hasn't been recorded, and so on and so forth. I can never remember the name of this thing. The good news is I don't have to. Google allows me to recognize the name. I don't have to recall it. I can recognize it. Okay, so that was all sorts of nice, fun, positive examples of systems, doing exactly what Nielsen would want them to do according to this heuristic. Let's talk about a case where we have a violation of this heuristic. And this is a fun example. This is has been the subject of some discussion in the user interface design community. And when I say discussion, I think I actually mean debate. Command line interfaces, right, required you to remember each command. Graphical user interfaces allow you to recognize the commands. Many people argue that gesture-based interfaces, like we're seeing in iOS and Android these days, are moving more back towards recall, back towards command line interfaces. And one example of this argument is the control panel on iOS. So this is the standard iOS home screen right here, right? To get this control panel, which has all sorts of important information, so turning on Wi-Fi, turning on Bluetooth, turning on Do Not Disturb mode, very importantly, playing your podcast or your music, and so on and so forth. But to do this, I have to know a priori, right, without knowing anything else, I have to know that I have to swipe up here to get that, right? This is effectively me remembering a specific command in a command line interface. They're more or less the same, right? I'm not recognizing, I'm recalling. And so people have been criticizing gesture-based interfaces for relying too much on recall, right? And this is, I would say, a violation of Nielsen's heuristic, and a pretty serious one given the importance of some of these commands. If you want to solve this problem, the solution is you give a visual indicator right at the bottom of you can see at the bottom of the screen, right? So you maybe have something here that's indicating, hey, swipe up. In certain cases, Apple does this, but not here, right? Not in the base home screen. So this would help users recognize a command rather than recall a command, and it would make this heuristic violation, it would make it go away, at least in my view. Okay, so let's move on to our next heuristic, which is aesthetic and minimalist design. What this heuristic tells us, the definition according to Nielsen, is that dialogue should not contain information which is irrelevant or rarely needed. Every extra unit of information in a dialogue competes with the relevant units of information and diminishes their relative visibility. Okay, let's look at a great violation of this particular heuristic, in this case from weather.com. Now when people go to weather.com, what type of information do they want? They want the weather, they want the current temperature, maybe the forecast. Any information that competes with that information is a violation of this heuristic. And boy, howdy, do we see a lot of competition here. We see a video about a phantom trailer thundering down the highway. Ooh, that looks good. We also see once a major movie set, now abandoned. Ooh, abandoned movie set. That sounds interesting. But what the user actually wanted to do was go for this information here, right? So this is a violation of this heuristic. I actually might give it I put 2 here earlier. I'd maybe give it a 3 here because it's such a serious violation of this particular heuristic, although the damage isn't particularly intense. You can see I've written here that weather conditions and forecast are swamped by other information, and boy, is that true. Okay, so this heuristic is actually very closely associated with the notion of chart junk from information visualization. Chart junk is stuff in a graph that is not just the data the graph is visualizing. So you can see this big coin is an example of chart junk here, and this monster is an example of chart junk here. You can see this is the graph that is actually being visualized, but it's in the monster's teeth here. So the reason I bring up chart junk is that, like this heuristic, chart junk, I think, is a little outdated and a little controversial. And let me tell you why. This is the one heuristic where I'm not in full agreement. Oftentimes, this stuff adds utility that isn't maybe directly obvious. And this came out in a really great study done by Scott Bateman and his colleagues back in 2010 that showed that visualizations with chart junk actually had the same communicative capability. They communicated the information just as well as the visualizations without chart junk, but that people remembered those charts and the content of those charts much better a little later. So this paper was controversial and caused a lot of discussion. And I think the end result, at least in my view, is that chart junk and non-minimalist design, violations of this heuristic, are okay if you're very intentional. Let me show you a good example of a success here, right? Google's Doodles. Right? Google's Doodles are classic non-minimalist design. Every day they have different things. It causes a distraction. People are going to Google not for the fancy doodles, but they're going to Google to search, right, and to see search results. But Google Doodles have this effect of building positive sentiment around the brand. They're fun. People associate Google with fun and these types of things. And in addition, minimalist design often is culturally defined. So as we discussed in the last course, certain cultures have a higher tolerance for information density, so a lot more can be crowded in one space than other cultures. Okay, so between some of the new work associated with chart junk and non-minimalist design being good and the cultural concerns here, I'm actually going to say it's okay to violate this heuristic in specific cases. And the rules of thumb that you should use when thinking about this heuristic are as follows, at least in my opinion, right? Other practitioners, other researchers might have different views. Okay, 2 rules of thumb. 1, eliminate extremes in non-minimalist design, right? So the weather.com example, that's an extreme. It's a little bit too much. Second, only violate this heuristic consciously. So you can violate this heuristic, but you better be able to back it up. And I thought this might be a fun sort of meta example of this, right? So I have rules of thumb. I put a thumb here. This is non-minimalist, but I figured it might be a good way for you to remember these 2 rules, right? It makes this slide more memorable. So at least that's my justification for using non-minimalist design. And I therefore am following in a very meta way these 2 rules of thumb. Okay, so let's jump to our final heuristic, which is help and documentation. This is an interesting one. Nielsen defines this heuristic as follows. Even though it is better if the system can be used without documentation. That's critically important. It's always better that the system can be used without documentation. Nielsen does say it may be necessary to provide help and documentation. Any such information should be easy to search, focused on the user's task, list concrete steps to be carried out, and not be too large. So this is the last heuristic, but is it the least heuristic? Yes, it is, right? So the key thing actually in that heuristic, I think, is that your system should be able to be used without help and documentation. Now, that said, if you have absolutely no documentation, 0, and it's a major system, I would actually say that's a violation of this heuristic and a pretty serious one. There are times when users, for whatever reason, can't figure something out, and we all know to turn to documentation. In that case, if it's not there, that's a pretty serious issue. You'll get a lot of complaints, you could imagine, right? The good news, though, is that in the modern day and age, documentations aren't just handing over your system to a technical writer to write a manual, right? There are all sorts of new, I think more engaging and often very, very much cheaper ways to build documentation. One of which is to use things like Stack Exchange or Stack Overflow, right? I taught a web applications class recently, and we use Meteor, and it's a new framework, and they were advertising their framework saying, we have a whole bunch of questions that have answers on Stack Overflow, right? They're effectively bragging about their documentation. This is a great way to build up documentation about your system. Now, in order to get a community around this and to get a lot of people asking questions, a lot of people giving answers, that's a whole nother can of worms. A lot of what the 5 faculty who teach this class study is figuring out ways to do that, but that's a different course. Okay, another thing you can do is build one of these answers websites, right, where you hire some people to answer customer questions. You don't need to have the community answering. You can just have people asking the questions. Microsoft has one of these. Apple has one of these as well. And then there's some other good stuff. Jake Wabrock, a colleague of ours at the University of Washington, has a startup that does contextual help, right? You remember in Nielsen's definition, there's a strong context element. You want help where you need it, when you need it, right? And this startup basically predicts what people are going to have trouble with and brings up that documentation. You can see here in let's see, over here, there's the cursor. You can see here in this little menu here, it'll give you the questions and answers relevant to the specific context in the specific application. So this is another interesting way to go about building help and documentation in a non-traditional or non-boring way. All right, we're done with our 10 heuristics. Good work, woohoo. We get a big check mark across the whole list. Here's some additional reading that you might be interested in, and I'll return next with a video about your assignment.